And joining us now on the line from New Brunswick, New Jersey, Lee Clarke, professor of sociology at Rutgers University and the author of Worst Cases, Terror and Catastrophe in the Popular Imagination. Professor Clarke, it's good to have you on the line. How are you tonight?
I'm well. Thanks for having me.
Glad to hear it. Well, I don't have to tell you that in the past decade, this world has seen its share of floods and hurricanes, tsunamis, fires, terrorist attacks, the list goes on. In your view, is it that there are more of these things going on these days, or are we just a lot better at publicizing them?
It's a controversial question because there actually are some data from a Swiss Re, a reinsurance company, that suggests that we actually are having more disasters, which is kind of hard to believe, but certainly we're covering them better. The internet, everything's 24/7. So every disaster has a you are there component that used not to be the case 20 years ago. The more significant question, I think, rather than are there more disasters now, is are there more vulnerabilities? And here it's unquestionably the case that there are more vulnerabilities. Around the world, people are moving to where water is, and water is very dangerous because of tsunamis, because of hurricanes, because of all sorts of reasons. Climate change is going to make those vulnerabilities even worse. So we're moving to dangerous places, and then we do things like destroy the environment, like we destroy the wetlands. So one of the reasons that New Orleans flooded so severely a few years ago is that the wetlands that used to protect the city from storm surge have been decimated for different kinds of reasons.
Well, let me follow up with this, because I have heard the word disaster used in connection with Katrina that you just referenced. Everything from Katrina to how could that quarterback miss that wide receiver? It's a disaster. Do we use this word too much?
When we use it in a football game, we're using it too much. It's a word that has, that in some ways, the technical definition in the literature, in scholarly literature on disasters, when some social unit is disrupted so severely that it needs some outside assistance to recover. Now, this is a very broad and in many ways vague term. If I had a serious car wreck on the way here and, I don't know, broken my neck, that would be a personal disaster, but it wouldn't make much difference for the community that I live in, or my university for that matter. So it's got a common sense usage that makes it too broad, but it's a generally purposeful word. We're mostly interested in threats to large-scale social units like cities and communities and even nation-states.
Okay, follow the logic of this next argument and then tell me what you think at the end of it. Because we talk about planning and preparing for disasters. And if you believe that human beings are rational creatures, then you've got to believe that we make decisions that are rational based on probabilities. So why do we focus on the worst case scenario, which a natural disaster would be, rather than on what's probable? And what's probable is most of us are never going to encounter a disaster, a natural disaster, during our lifetimes. You following me?
There's a lot of scholarship and a lot of policymakers who actually say that we should be making policy, should be paying attention only to that which is most likely to happen. And that is a probabilistic argument. And so they say, for example, people who are afraid of flying are experiencing irrational fear because the likelihood that a commercial airliner will go down is so small that it's not worth worrying about. However, my argument is that people who are 35,000 feet in the sky, if the plane gets in a lot of trouble, probability doesn't matter. You're either going to die or survive, chances are. If the plane gets in a lot of trouble at 35,000 feet, the outcome is not going to be so good, and probability doesn't really matter there. And that's what people are worried about, along with the probabilities. So that if you're really high in the sky in a big plane and it starts bouncing around, people get a little nervous. They continue to fly. The idea that people, people know that it's unlikely that they'll get in an airplane crash, but they also know that if they do get in one, the consequences are going to be severe. So there are a lot of realms in our lives where we make choices, and choices on the basis of the worst case, and it's still considered rational. So, for example, after every commercial airplane crash in the United States, the officials go and investigate those crashes, and they do so not on any logical probability. From a probabilistic point of view, going to investigate every single crash is a waste of resources. But by golly, we want that as a society, because occasionally they learn something that helps prevent another airplane crash in the future. Now, this is what I call possibilistic thinking. And it's not a replacement for probabilistic thinking. It's a complement to that. So on grounds of probability, I invest my retirement money in the market. You might call it irrational these days. But occasionally I buy a lottery ticket. I know that the chances are very low that I'll win the lottery, but it's kind of fun. I get a little thrill, but I don't spend lots of money. There's a good example of putting probabilism together with possibilism. It can be misused. Possibilistic thinking can be misused, most famously when the Bush administration used fear of worst cases as a justification to invade Iraq. But all sorts of thinking can be misused.
There is the assumption, and you can tell us from your research whether this is accurate or not, but there is an assumption that when panic sets in, like when you lose a couple of engines at 35,000 feet,
right.
You know, all bets are off. There is complete social breakdown. People fend for themselves, et cetera, et cetera. Can you tell us if that's in fact accurate?
I can tell you it's not accurate. It happens in every disaster movie. When the building catches on fire, the office building crumbles, the big earthquake comes, whatever, the twister happens, the nuclear meltdown, and people freak out and they push over old ladies, and they kick children, and they do all kinds of wild and crazy stuff, and it's so much fun. But that's entertainment. That's not a documentary. The fact is, we have over 50 years of research on how people collectively respond to disaster. And the overwhelming set of findings is that people do not lose their minds. They do not lose their sense of connection to one another. And that panic is very rare. I'll give you a great example. In the summer of 2005, there was a huge airplane coming into Toronto International Airport. And it was an Airbus A340, and it came in a little too fast, and there was a storm going on, and it landed just fine. But then it slipped off the end of the runway, and then, just like in a disaster movie, the thing caught fire. Now, the astounding thing about this accident is that everybody on board, 309 people, everybody survived. And the official investigation concluded that everybody got off that plane in under 2 minutes. So it had to have been. I have no doubt that the people on that burning airplane, the airplane subsequently just completely burned up. I have no doubt that they were frightened out of their minds. Who wouldn't be? Being in a burning airplane, that's a perfectly appropriate place to be frightened. But they couldn't have panicked, not in the way that we see in disaster movies, piling up at the door, or they wouldn't have been able to get out. It just happens time and again. The stories that came out of the Twin Towers after that worst case day, 10 years ago in New York, people were stopping to help each other. They were helping complete strangers. They were helping people who were in wheelchairs. And people say, oh, those times people are they're finding their inner hero, but in fact they're doing what most people do in the wake of a disaster. People bind together, and they help each other. Don't get me wrong. I'm not Mr. like Pollyanna about human nature. I think human nature can be just as self-interested as modern economics thinks it is, but human nature can also be altruistic, and so we have both things going on. Panic is quite rare.
Well, since you've mentioned economics, maybe I should follow up from there. You've talked about man-made disasters in the case of the Twin Towers. or natural disasters, you know, as well. But what about economic disasters?
Right.
Do people behave differently when they are struck with those circumstances?
I think that they do. We don't have, people in my field haven't really studied economic disasters per se, you know, as an object of study. I think that that's one of those places where the word disaster is used more metaphorically. For example, when the economic disaster / meltdown / catastrophe happened in 2008, just the fact of using, people are thrashing about trying to find the right descriptor. Was it a meltdown? Well, you know, that really just applies to nuclear power stations, but it kind of works. Was it a disaster? Well, sort of, but it's, people are using the phrase, they're attaching disaster to economic in more of a common sense way.
In your book, you not only talk about the disasters that have already occurred, but you also predict worst case scenarios that we ought to be prepared for. What's at the top of that list?
Well, in the United States, it's so mundane. The trains are almost completely unregulated, and they carry the most dangerous things, the most dangerous materials we need in a high consumption society, particularly chlorine. But it's not just chlorine. There's a lot of other things. You remember that that bridge in Minneapolis that shook itself to pieces a few years ago?
Absolutely, yes.
Well, it was the video was stunning. It was another one of those things where, hey, we're there all the time because we watched it crumble to pieces. And that was frightening enough, but what was going on under the bridge was the most frightening thing. There are pictures of grain cars, railroad cars, that were crushed by the bridge that fell on them. Had that been chlorine gas, millions of people could have been put at risk. So it's so mundane, but the trains are one of the things at the top of my list. Flu pandemic is another one. And in the United States, the electric power grid is, by all accounts from reasonable experts, the power grid is very vulnerable. And if you imagine Manhattan suffering rolling blackouts for several months, it would be the end of the world as we know it.
Well, in our last minute here, do you want to give us some prescriptions as to how you might change policy to avert some of those worst cases?
Yeah, sure. I would demilitarize disaster policy. We assume that people will panic, and we assume that somebody has to be in control, and we assume that regular people can't be trusted with bad news. So one of the things that and all of those things are false in the main. And so one thing I would do is I would make us more resilient at the local level, because when disasters happen, they happen in your office, they happen in your home, they happen in our communities. And that's where resilience really should be happening, and we should be, or will happen, and that's where we should be pushing resources down rather than up.
Understood. Lee Clarke from Rutgers University, author of Worst Cases. Thanks so much for joining us on the line from New Brunswick, New Jersey tonight. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.